A cinema camera is not going to save your film. No amount of lighting gear or dollies or gimbals are going to create cinema. Cinema is not a LUT, it's not a color grade. In fact, there's one thing that's constantly overlooked when talking about that dirty word, cinematic, and that is composition. Hi, my name's Justin Brooks. I'm a director in DOP. I've worked a great deal within the television and feature film space. And when I first got started, I would scour the pages of American Cinematographer, trying to find anything I could about the gear that was being used by my favorite DOPs, the gear that was making my favorite feature films, because I was convinced if I used those same tools, I'd get the same outcome. That's how cinema was made, right? Through lights and cameras and dollies. And later on, when I would start listening to podcasts, it would drive me nuts when my favorite cinematographers were only talking about story. I thought that they were like gatekeeping the gear. Why are they talking story? They're cinematographers. And it would take me years in my career before I finally realized they were telling me how to create cinematic images the entire time. And it has nothing to do with the gear they shoot with. It has everything to do with story. It would take me years before I would fully understand story is cinematic. And the way we interpret that story visually is composition. So, what is composition? Composition is the arrangement of visual elements within a frame to guide the audience eye, to tell stories, and to convey emotion. And we gather those elements to break down the story that each frame is telling. For me, I personally like to break those elements down into three separate categories. That is light, dimension, and position. So let's start with light. See, when we think about light, we should be thinking about control. Control over where the viewer is looking in the frame. See, we can spend honestly, days talking about light. Light is so incredibly important to a cinematographer. It is the palette in which we paint with, right? It can tell us, mood. It can tell us moral alignment. It can tell us it can give us that inside look into a character's psyche. But really, at the root of it, we can use light to guide our audience towards the story. One cinematographer that has an absolute command over light is the Prince of Darkness himself, Gordon Willis. Through the films like The Godfather, The Parallax View, and one of my absolute favorites, Clute, we can see Willis's absolute mastery in directing the eye. Gordon Willis oftentimes uses light to almost actually spotlight his subjects and really let the rest of the world fall away into shadow. Hence the cool as hell nickname, the Prince of Darkness. He uses light to fully guide the viewer's eye. We know exactly where in the frame to look. The eye has nowhere to wander and really goes directly to the action that we should be experiencing. It goes directly to the story. So we oftentimes will use that shadow to take away distraction. And usually he uses the brightest part of the frame to direct the eye. Oftentimes, he'll even set a subject next to a light so that our eye goes directly to that super bright part of the frame and thus right to our main character. Now, conversely, when we brighten the world around them, it's often the darker subjects that draw the eye. Now, another cinematographer that uses this technique is the amazing Darius Khondji, one of my absolute favorite cinematographers. When I first saw Seven, I thought I could smell the image. That's when I really first noticed cinematography. Now, in the movie Seven, Khondji often goes the Gordon Willis route and really utilizes pools of light to direct the eye. We always know exactly where we're supposed to be looking in Seven. He lets the rest of the world fall away into shadow and really draws the eye to the action. Shadow is unbelievably important in a frame and directing the eye. See, when we overlight and we light an entire frame evenly, we oftentimes create what we call a flat image. We're making our viewer search for the action throughout the entire frame, and we've lost that control. Now, this can also be used as a tool. Oftentimes these things can. If you want to make your viewer search the frame, then you know how to do it. even lighting, creating, an even spread of light, making them search for the action. It's a tool unto itself. But Kanji in 7 was intent on always directing our eye to the action, whether that meant exposing the action and letting the world fall away in shadow, or conversely, lighting the world and letting our characters fall away in shadow, which he did all the time. 7 is oftentimes lit from the outside world, letting the darker parts of the image be what we are paying attention to. Once again, when everything else is lit, it's the darker parts of the frame that direct the eye. See, shadow is a great way to also help us understand our characters and the subconscious. When we look at our characters like Clute or like Mills, we understand through shadow and light that they are split between two worlds. They have a choice to make. Gordon Willis would also use shadow to really talk about the subconscious of his characters in The Godfather, really letting shadow tell the story. He would oftentimes light from above, letting the eyes fall away into shadow, deep shadows around the face. It had really let us in on the sinister subconscious of all our characters. Light is unbelievably important to composition and helping tell the story in each frame. It's so important that it couldn't possibly be covered entirely in such a small segment of a video. But light is not the only tool we have in telling our story in our compositions. Next up, dimension. Dimension is all about depth, taking a 2D format and finding a way to immerse our viewer into a three-dimensional world. I often like to think about dimension in pretty simple terms, and that is foreground, midground, background. So layering the frame in this way not only gives the frame dimension, but it once again directs the viewer's eye. You sensing a theme here? Using focus and dimension, we can really help aid our viewer in where they should be paying attention to within the frame. Or we can force our viewer to search the frame, creating tension. One of my absolute favorite examples of forcing a viewer to look around a frame is in Gore Verbinski's The Ring. See, throughout the entire opening scene of The Ring, cinematographer Bazzelli uses wide open backgrounds to constantly make us search the frame. We're always waiting for something to pop up. As horror fans, we know when we see empty space back there, there's something bound to be there. And that creates a tension throughout the entire opening scene, and is one of the reasons The Ring is so horrifying. Through foreground, middle ground, and background, we can really isolate characters and make sure that our viewer is locked into where that story is in the frame. We can also use this technique mixed with good blocking to become more intimate with our characters or to follow them through a scene, making a scene more dynamic. Again, foreground, middle ground, background creates a great opportunity for good blocking. And when talking about dimension in a frame, you absolutely have to talk leading lines. See, leading lines are the way a cinematographer directs an eye in the frame. This is where the rule of thirds really comes in handy. Breaking our frame into thirds helps us place the action in the more important parts of the frame, or the more aesthetically pleasing parts of the frame, places that an eye naturally goes in a frame. You can talk about the rule of thirds in many different ways. You can bring up the golden ratio. It's really all about the most aesthetically pleasing places to put things in the frame, but it's also the way we have trained our viewer for many, many years. See, we've been watching movies for over 100 years now, and it's really trained the viewer where in a frame they should be looking. And if we use those points to our advantage, it helps us draw our viewer in, and they fall into the story. A great example of this can be found in Constantine. No matter how wide this shot is, every line directs us to exactly where the action is. Now, it doesn't hurt that that action is at the center of the frame, a place that every viewer naturally goes to. When framing a shot, it never hurts to use the rule of thirds. Throw up that 3x3 grid to really focus the action of the frame. And then you can use your leading lines in the rest of the frame to draw the eye directly to that section of the frame. Once again, the rule of thirds is an entire other video, and we can definitely talk further about that, but it's really just about balance. Anyway, the great thing about the rule of thirds is that if you practice it enough, eventually it becomes second nature, and it's something that just becomes kind of burned into your visual mind. You're able to set up shots without constantly throwing up that grid, and understand that you're still adhering to the rule of thirds, should you choose to. Always remember, rules are there to break, but you first need to understand the rule before you'll know how to break the rule. If that makes sense. You need to know the rule you need to know the rule so that you can break the rule effectively. Rules are there to break. Break some rules. Do your thing. Now, moving on, the third and final part of my composition trifecta, position. Hell, it's in the word, composition. Now, position in a frame can not only help us lead the eye and create those leading lines, but it also helps us tell who has power in a story. We can either place the camera just below the subject, creating a sense of power and prestige, or conversely, we can shoot from a high angle, taking power away or showing vulnerability. It doesn't just have to do with where you put the camera, either low angle, high angle, but you can actually use space within the frame to show power dynamics. One of the perfect examples of this is the amazing cinematography in Parasite. When headed towards wealth, our characters are always moving upward in the frame. And then, when headed back towards poverty, they are always moving downward in the frame. This is really a subconscious nod to the hierarchy of the classes. Throughout this film, we can see the power dynamics in size and position in the frame. Lost in Translation is another great example of how to use position to isolate your characters. Show how separate they feel from the world, pushed to the corners of the frame and swallowed by the space around them. We understand the story we're watching immediately. And that, again, is the key to it all, story. Frame composition is far more than just an aesthetic choice, it's a story choice. And that's the question we should always be asking ourselves as filmmakers and cinematographers. What is the story I'm trying to tell within this frame? This is why so many cinematographers will tell you again and again and again, it doesn't matter what you shoot your film on. Gear is not what makes a film, it's story. That's why we've seen so many films shot on iPhones or mini DV cameras or so many cameras in between, because it's story that matters. Gear, not so much. What you should really be concerning yourself with is how are you telling your story visually? How are you using all these elements in composition to tell the story? So how do we continue to practice these composition skills? It's not every day that you're shooting a short film or shooting a feature film or a doc, and we want to kind of keep that muscle strong. Me personally, I practice my composition by way of stills photography. And to create even more focus, I shoot 35mm film. I love to create that focus on a single frame, and that is when I'm really diving into light, dimension, and position. Really making sure that in one single frame, I'm telling a story. See, there are so many photographers that have been referred to as cinematic. They don't shoot feature films, they don't shoot 24 frames per second, they shoot one single frame, and with that frame, they tell a story, using so many of the tools we've talked about today. So personally, I think if you really want to practice composition, the best way to do it is through stills photography. Really focus on that single frame. Focus on telling your story in that one single frame. Because if you can tell a story in a single frame, then, God, 24 frames per second is going to be a breeze. It's all about really focusing on those three tools in composition. We are visual storytellers, and that's the key, story. You should be asking yourself with every frame, am I telling this story? Story doesn't end with a script. Story goes through every element of production, and we as cinematographers and filmmakers need to be understanding how to tell that story visually. And we need to tell that story with every single frame we shoot. As a cinematographer or a filmmaker, you should always be asking yourself why. Why are you placing the camera here? Why are you lighting from this side? Why are you letting these things fall to shadow? It is our job to film with intention, to create frames with intention. We should always be asking ourselves why. And if you can answer that question, if you can explain your story through light, dimension, and position, then you can create something truly cinematic. Thank you so much for watching, and if you've gotten anything out of this video, please do like, subscribe, do all the YouTube stuff, and I'll definitely be back here going way deeper into many of these points, especially lighting. I absolutely love lighting as a cinematographer. That is your palette, and I can't wait to get deeper there. But thanks again for checking it out, and I'll see you in the next one.